My name is Yousef Munayyer. I'm the Executive Director of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, a coalition of hundreds of groups working throughout the United States to advocate for change in U.S. policy for advancing Palestinian rights. It is a pleasure to be with you here this morning. Thank you, Dr. Anthony, for putting this together. And thank you in particular for putting Palestine at the top of the agenda at the conference. And I know that I speak for many, particularly many Arabs throughout the Arab world, as public opinion polls have shown us consistently, that they would hope that countries around the world and in their region as well continue to put Palestine at the top of their respective agendas all the time. We're here to talk about the Palestinian future, and before I introduce our outstanding panel today, I will just say a few brief things to frame our conversation. We're going to be hearing a lot about the situation on the ground, and I think what you will see is that perhaps at no time since 1948 have Palestinians been in such a difficult and weak position relative to the strength that Israel can bring to bear against them. We know that there is division among Palestinians, although we are seeing the stirrings of some form of reconciliation between two Palestinian factions. The fractured nature of Palestinian politics continues to be a challenge. And the ironic thing is that despite this material weakness, there is also tremendous Israeli vulnerability today in ways that have not existed before. We see a Israeli politics that has doubled down on the policies of the extreme right, continues to move further in that direction, and is alienating people who believe in the values that governments, particularly governments in the West, claim to espouse to, the values of freedom, justice, and equality. So there are certainly opportunities for Palestinians today to create new coalitions, to find new avenues towards strength and leverage. And the question is, how is it possible for them to seize that opportunity? And I hope that's something that our panel could get into at some point today and perhaps further into during our question and answer session. And so with that, I would like to begin by introducing our panel in the order in which they will speak. Mr. Sean Carroll, who is, there he is, here on my left, is an international development executive with 30 years of experience working in 65 different countries across Africa, the Americas, Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. And as of September of 2017, he is president and CEO of American Near East Refugee Aid, ANERA, working with Palestinian and Syrian refugees and other vulnerable populations in Palestine and Lebanon. ANERA is an organization that does amazing work, humanitarian work, on the ground in Palestine and beyond. And Sean has recently returned from the region, so we look forward to hearing from him his impressions of the humanitarian situation on the ground. Following him will be Mr. Talib Salhab, who is here on my right. He is an international development professional with over 20 years of executive leadership experience in the private and nonprofit sectors. And as Vice President of Global Programs at IREX, an international development organization, he's led programs operating in over 100 countries, including the Youth Development Resource Centers operating in all 13 governorates of the West Bank and Jerusalem. And so we look forward to hearing from Talib about his impressions on youth unemployment and the particular challenge that that presents to Palestinians. And then last but not least, of course, on the far left is Noura Erakat, who's a human rights attorney, activist, and assistant professor at George Mason University, a co-founding editor of Jadaliyya, which is an e-magazine, and an editorial board member at the Journal of Palestine Studies. Noura is a fantastic voice on Palestinian issues and a crystal clear analyst who will round us out by analyzing the political situation and how we can move forward from here. So with that, I will turn it over to Sean. Sean?
Great, thank you, Dr. Munayyer, thank you, Yousef. I feel like a bit of an imposter. Not only, of course, am I not Palestinian, I am definitely not a Palestinian expert, an expert on Palestine. And in case you don't believe me, I'm meeting for the first time today my fellow three panelists. So that tells you I really am not an expert on Palestine. Thank you, Dr. John Duke Anthony and the National Council of U.S. Arab Relations. My predecessor, Bill Corcoran, who was with the NERA for 10 years, gave me a large handful of people I should go see immediately. And of course, John Duke was at the top of the list. And I had a very good conversation with him my first week on the job, and I hope and expect to be able to call on his counsel throughout my tenure at ANERA. And thank you also for dedicating this conference to, among others, Peter Gubser, who was ANERA president for 30 years, in addition to being a board member of NCUSAR. Bill Corcoran told me that the biggest challenge I would face as president and CEO of ANERA is keeping spirits up. It's a tough region to work in. Palestine is a tough country to work in. Most of our just over 150 staff are from the region. More than 90% are working and from the communities they live in. They're from and grew up in the refugee camps that we work in. Only one of our 140 staff in Palestine and Lebanon is an expat. Paul Butler is our Palestine country director. He's here. I'm joined also by Nasser Kadus, our chief agronomist in the West Bank, and Hani Al-Madoun, who's our director of donor development. So if you have follow-up questions, I may call on them. But let me give you a couple of impressions from my recent trip, and then a couple of focus points on Gaza, which I think really is the key immediate question on the future of Palestine. So I lived in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem, and Beit Hanina 20 years ago. My twin children were born there. I lived there from 96 to 98. There were still hopes post-Oslo. And I hadn't been back until 5 years ago when I took my family on a visit. We left before my children were a year old, so they really didn't know where they were born, and so we took them back to visit. And the impressions with a 15-year hiatus, the biggest one was the wall, right? It was very distressing to see the wall. And the wall was right next to our house in Beit Hanina. And a wall, purely for the aesthetics, it's ugly. But it's depressing, it's divisive. And the wall never has been a long-term solution. So that was the big impression from the visit 5 years ago. The visit most recently, a week after I started at ANERA just last month, was the amazing amount of construction. And I was only in the West Bank, and we didn't get a permit in time for Gaza, and I have it now, and I'll be going to Gaza next week. But I was only in the West Bank, and the impression was the amount of construction. And to the untrained or to the atrophied eye, it was a little difficult in the distance to tell whether that was an Israeli settlement or a Palestinian expansion of an existing Palestinian town. And of course, there's too much settlement building. I don't need to spend time on that. The Palestinian construction, though, was quite impressive, and it's a lot of it is emigre money. It's not built from the economy there. A lot of the apartments are bought by Palestinians but empty. But you look at Rawabi and Ishtashadi in Ramallah, but also not just in Ramallah. We were in Jenin. We have a fantastic wastewater reuse project in Jenin. And Yousef, you mentioned that Noura does humanitarian work, but we're also doing quite a bit of development work and have been and we're increasing our development work. And the project in Jenin, the wastewater, the sewage treatment plant, the water had been washing down the Wadi. The Israelis were fining the Palestinian Authority because the water was going into Israel and, of course, using the water themselves. So Noura suggested that we could work with the Palestinian Water Authority, with the Jenin municipality, and with farmers to use that water for agricultural irrigation. And we worked with a farmers cooperative. They were skeptical; it was gray water, but they put in some of their own money. They're now doing 8 to 10 harvests a year instead of 1. They're going to make their money back in the first year. They hired away a Noura staff person to be the cooperative director. They bought him a car. They've got more farmers who want to join. They want to scale. Jenin has 2 neighborhoods that aren't connected yet to the wastewater treatment plant, so there's more supply to meet this growing demand. The cooperative and the municipality on their own, without a Noura, have worked to figure out how to get some water to the parks and for beautification in Jenin. And I got the sense that Jenin, which only a few years ago was suffering terribly, was really on the brink of becoming a model city, sort of the Medellin of Palestine, if you will. So very impressed with what was going on. Politically, you know, the two-state solution, if it's not dead already, it's on life support. And Palestinians told me, and you can see and feel, and it's absolutely human nature and perfectly human, they just want a normal, safe, healthy life, jobs with opportunity. They're tired of politics and conflict, and they said, we'll live under whomever will provide us that. Now, what about Gaza? And Paul Butler gave us a very good presentation at our board meeting this week, and I'll use some of what he told us, and I haven't been there yet to see Noura's work. Once I do, I'm sure I'm going to be very excited about some of the development work that we're doing there, but let me give you a sense of where I think things are. So on the big picture, donor pledges to Gaza, we're now 3 years past the Cairo Donor Conference, and only 53% of the pledged donations have been dispersed. The United States dispersed all 277 million of its funding, but if you look at the top 7 donors, 2.725 billion of the 3.5 billion pledge comes from the top 7, so 78% of it. But those top 7 pledgers have actually dispersed only 43% of what they pledged to disperse. And the GCC are the big laggards. They've done less than 24%. 3 years later, this was all supposed to be dispersed in the first year. And it's lots of different reasons, right? It's politics, it's access issues, it's corruption. But Qatar and Saudi Arabia have only done 22% of what they pledged. Those are the 2 largest donors, and the UAE is at 30%. So why is it? Part of it is access, and this affects our programming, even though Noura has gotten through USAID and the Palestinian Community Infrastructure Development Project. We have gotten some of that funding, but the access is restricted, as we know, in and out of Gaza, enforced by both Israel and Egypt. The coordination of government activities in the territories, COGAT, controls those entry points. Egypt controls Rafah, but as we know, there's been an average of only 3 days a month over the past 3 years where Rafah was open. Obviously, hopefully, the reconciliation changes that. There was a fantastic and disheartening flowchart of how the Gaza reconstruction mechanism works that I can't show you now, and you'll be grateful because it's dizzying and depressing to see what we need to go through to get infrastructure and development projects approved in Gaza. But let me just give you a sense. Since the Cairo conference, 0.8 million tons of cement has gone in and 6.4 million are needed. So 5.6 million tons of cement required has not been able to get in. Let me just, in my last couple of minutes here, tell you what we have been able to do and what I think needs to happen. So under the Palestinian Community Infrastructure Development Project funded by USAID, we have 18 projects in Gaza. 10 have been completed, 3 are ongoing, and 5 are pending. But those 5 pending ones are the larger ones, the more difficult to get through the Gaza reconstruction mechanism. And the GRM is jointly run, but usually it's a 19, 20-year-old Israeli army soldier that we have to deal with, who probably doesn't know much about it and may not have a whole lot of care about helping us get stuff in. So it's been a real struggle. The projects we completed, 290,000 beneficiaries in 5 cities and communities in Gaza, but as I said, small amounts. The predecessor to PCID for Noura was EWAS, the Emergency Water and Sanitation Project. Over 5 years, there were $67 million in that project, and 20% of it went to Gaza. PCID is $100 million over 5 years, but right from the start, there was a recognition Gaza would be difficult, and so only 10% was expected to go to Gaza. That's a real shame right from the beginning, right? That's a shame that we, from the start, have to say of a $100 million project, only 10 million is going to go to Gaza. Gaza's over 2 million people, 3 times the size of DC. There are 88 countries, roughly, in the world that are smaller than Gaza. So this is a country that's not getting the help it needs. We've spent only 3 million of that 10. Hopefully those projects get released through the GRM and we get to do all 10. But there's a lot more work that needs to be done. What we see is that the Palestinians working with us, the NGOs, the municipalities that we work with are doing real development, women's centers, youth centers, irrigation projects, water and sanitation projects, and that's what we really hope the reconciliation process, politics, increased donations will help us be able to work with the Palestinians we work with. So I'll just leave you with the thought and the policy recommendation, open up the entry and exit points and let life flow. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Sean, and thank you, Dr. Anthony and the National Council for your kind invitation. I think Ambassador Zumlot did a great job summarizing the current political situation and state of affairs. And I have to say, as a relatively young Palestinian American, I'd like to say it's a breath of fresh air to hear someone talking about the importance of the new generation and of investing and supporting youth. So that was great to hear. So in my remarks today, I'm going to focus on one aspect of the challenge currently in Palestine, which is the issue of youth unemployment. As many of you know, the youth unemployment challenge and crisis is one of the most pressing issues facing the world today. Today, nearly 300 million youth globally are unemployed and not participating in education or training programs. The Middle East and North Africa regions have one of the highest rates of youth unemployment in the world, with 28% of young people being unemployed and many more underemployed and not participating in the labor market altogether. The situation not only poses an immediate challenge to the youth, but is also symptomatic of greater labor market challenges, which have far-reaching economic, development, and security implications for the region as a whole. In most parts of the world, the youth unemployment crisis is fueled by a downturn in the economy and a skills mismatch, youth that simply don't have the skills to meet the needs of today's labor market. In Palestine, these factors, combined with the negative repercussions of 50 years of Israeli occupation, fuel the youth unemployment crisis. According to the ILO and UNCA, the United Nations Trade and Development Conference, Palestinian youth unemployment is one of the highest in the region. In 2016, youth unemployment in the West Bank was 26%, and in Gaza, 57%. This does not include the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of youth who just stopped looking for jobs altogether. The unemployment rate in Gaza of 57% was among the highest in the world, which provides strong evidence that the labor market was barely functioning and that a young person today is likely to be unemployed for a very long period of time. GDP per capita in Palestine today is at the same level that it was in 1999, which is a clear indication of the human cost and lost economic potential resulting in large part from the repercussions of the occupation, and in the case of Gaza, the ongoing 10-year siege and blockade of Gaza. The situation is further exacerbated by restrictions on the import of essential goods, which escalate production costs, depress investment, and set the economy onto a path of high employment and widespread poverty. Unless current trends are reversed, unemployment will worsen, per capita income will fall, food security will deepen, and poverty will further increase, compounding the risk of political crisis fueled by further economic decline. So this is the situation at a kind of 30,000-foot level. So the question is, what can be done about this? Dr. Anthony asked us all to present some specific policy recommendations. Needless to say that in the big picture, a resolution to the Arab-Israeli, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is going to be the most important element that's going to address this issue and many other issues. But in the absence of a political settlement, the prospects of which seem pretty bleak in the short term, there are things that policymakers and the donor community can do to help address this critically pressing challenge. So there are three things that I want to focus on. Number one, the investment in and support of workforce development programs. In my career, I've had the privilege and the opportunity of working all throughout the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem on workforce development programs. And I've had firsthand experience seeing how small interventions, targeted interventions around job placement and training programs can really help transform the lives of Palestinian youth and really make a difference in their lives. So it's critically important for the donor community to understand that it's important to support those types of programs. And programs supported by USAID, Al-Walid Philanthropies, and many others that are relatively modest investments can make a tremendous difference for the young people. The second area, given the relatively lack of a number of jobs, is around entrepreneurship and the importance to support those types of programs, specifically programs that generate self-employment and micro-entrepreneurship. And the third is around virtual jobs, as we live in a new economy where people can work anywhere in the world. There is a big promise for Palestinians to work virtually and support those types of programs. So those are three in the workforce development. Second is around educational reform. And I was in the West Bank several months ago meeting with Dr. Sabri Saidam, who's the current Minister of Education, who I think is a visionary leader and understands the need to reform the education system. So things like strengthening the vocational and training systems is really important. Embedding entrepreneurship programs and other within the school curricula is also important and can make a big difference. And giving youth the options of going on a vocational track post-secondary instead of just seeking four-year degrees, because unemployment among college graduates is actually much higher than it is among non-college graduates in Palestine and frankly in most of the Arab world. And the third area is private sector engagement and the need to provide support to the private sector. Once again, I've worked on programs supported by the World Bank and others in which the private sector is supported to hire and engage Palestinian interns, thus building their skills. Engaging the private sector in identification of skills standards and related training needs is critically important. I know I have time here. Yousef is keeping time. So I will end by saying this. As I said, Nothing is going to address this conflict holistically than the end of the occupation, but in the interim, these programs are critically, critically important. One of the most enjoying part of my life and my career is to actually get to meet the young people whose lives the programs I've worked on have impacted. And I've met young people all throughout Palestine who were unemployed for a year, 2 years, 3 years. Many of them have lost complete hope. Young women who have been sitting at home for years on end. And these programs really help transform their lives, help transform their communities, and set a really, really important standard for the future to come. Supporting these programs will have far-reaching positive economic, development, and security implications for the Palestinian people and for the region as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Talib. I know it's difficult to try to keep it to the time limitation, but because we're running a little bit late and want to try to accommodate questions, we're trying to keep things a little bit more concise. Noura, please.
That's the worst thing you can possibly tell me. I'm not known for being concise, but I will try right now. I want to answer the call that Yousef presented to us, which is how do we evaluate the future based on the equation of the material weakness of Palestinians together with the vulnerability that Israel is experiencing, together with what Ambassador Zumlot has pointed out to us, which is an unprecedented nature of non-violent mass movement amongst Palestinians, marked by one of his examples of a mass protest in Jerusalem that forced Israel to remove its security cameras around the Al-Aqsa compound. He didn't mention, but I'd like to mention the April 2017 mass hunger strike of over 1,400 Palestinian political prisoners who we have to understand that they're still governed under a military occupation, which allows for Israel to incarcerate any Palestinian without charge or trial under an emergency regime that has been in place for over 7 decades, which is a bit of a contradiction when you think of emergency and its temporary nature. To date, from 1967 to the present, over 80% of the Palestinian population has been detained, and today 600 of them are detained without charge or trial under administrative detention. In April 2017, a mass hunger strike for over 2 months was waged in order to improve those conditions and to bring these unacceptable ongoing forms of domination to continue, which are unfortunately falling on deaf ears because we continue to return to political paradigms that unfortunately are excluding this population that is fighting for its life. Within the United States, it's no better. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which is a completely grassroots-led movement from the bottom up, has been ridiculed at first for being too naive, to the point where it's now being criminalized. The Senate is considering an anti-BDS bill that would subject Americans engaging in nonviolent protests and the exercise of their free speech to up to 20 years of detention and over $250,000 in civil fines. There has to be, there's something of a contradiction in terms when we consider this, and consider also that there are 14 states that are trying to outlaw a movement that is otherwise ridiculed as being ineffective and naive. So what I want to do, given this context, is think about what does that mean for the future? And for the future, I want to ask a question, and I'll leave it as a question and share some empirical evidence of what justifies asking this question, which is at which point does the Palestinian leadership and a Palestinian movement and their allies decide that the U.S. has proved to be more counterproductive to achieving Palestinian independence than it has been beneficial? That's the primary question I want to ask. To ask that question, I want to periodize the forms of the Palestinian struggle for independence, what others may call resistance to their subjugation, as an exercise of thinking historically that the present is not timeless, that this present we're living in is historical and has been subject to historical junctures, which means that the Palestinian leadership has the option of shifting course as it has in the past. For the lack of time, I won't go into details about these junctures. I'll simply be descriptive, but happy to answer questions about them. I provide 4 different junctures. The first is from 1917 to 1948, during which time Palestinians resisted the British mandate in an effort to prove their eligibility for statehood and independence alongside a number of other anti-colonial movements that were seeking their independence. In that moment, Palestinians proved their literacy rates, their education rates, demonstrated their ability for self-organization. They had been organized and categorized as an A mandate, which meant that they were close enough to independence and self-rule and did not need the extreme tutelage of a mandatory power. But they were never eligible for that independence, not as a matter of legal determination, but as a matter of sovereign fiat. When Lord Balfour said, he says, and this is worthwhile, as Ambassador Zumlot has pointed out, we're in 100 years since this moment, and we haven't really changed these conditions. Lord Balfour says, quote, "The great powers are committed to Zionism, and Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long traditions, in present needs and future hopes of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit the ancient lands." That prima facie ineligibility, Palestinians could not prove that they could be eligible for self-rule because of a decision by an overriding power. From 1967, then the next phase to, from 1948 to 1967, Palestinians now enter a different phase where they are a derivative of an Arab cause. Where Arab countries are waging this battle, Palestinians are a derivative concern and are mainly refugees framed as a humanitarian issue where we need to provide aid in order to resuscitate them, which is a very comfortable conversation to have, because you can have aid and maintain domination indefinitely. And it was the 1967 war, it was the catastrophic Arab defeat that shifted the calculus of the Palestinian national movement, especially because Egypt under Gamal Abdel Nasser, and Jordan under the leadership of King Hassan accepted the terms of Security Council Resolution 242, which reified the juridical erasure of a Palestinian people as it had been inscribed in the Palestine Mandate in 1922. In 1967, they don't correct this mistake, but instead continue to refer to Palestinians as refugees and acquiesce to respecting the borders of Israel without ensuring the rights of Palestinians. This then catapults the Palestinian national movement into the third phase between 1967 and 1993, which most regard as the revolutionary phase of the Palestinian movement. During this time, and especially from 73 to 78, where we see the PLO establish itself at the United Nations under Resolutions 3236 and 3237 as the sole and legitimate leadership of the Palestinian people, with the status of a member, a non-voting entity of the United Nations, we see Palestinians take the helm of their own future. But even within this moment, Yasser Arafat, chairman of the PLO at the time, and also the leader of a moderate movement within the PLO, had been angling to enter into the U.S.'s sphere of influence. So what we see culminate in 1991, and then in the signing of Oslo in 1993, the seeds for that were planted as early as 1973, when the PLO, moderate camp of the PLO, realizes that Egypt and Syria are not eager to wage a conventional war against Israel. We have to enter into the Geneva into the Geneva Peace Conference. Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, is adamant that the PLO remain outside and marginalized, and instead disaggregates the Arab-Israeli conflict to establish bilateral relations between the US, Israel, and individual Arab states in a way that actually paralyzes the PLO and diminishes its influence. But that desire to enter into the U.S.'s sphere of influence in the 1970s comes to a head, and that opportunity presents itself on the heels of the Palestinian uprising, or what's known as the Intifada in 1987 to 1991. Chairman Arafat enters into that peace agreement without adequate and sufficient regard to the details of the agreement, which have ensured that Palestinians can achieve no more than autonomy or derivative sovereignty that is conditional on Israeli acquiescence. That holding position continues to be the one that Palestinians remain in since 1993 to the present. Now, if you compare each of those junctures that I've laid out that are driven by the Palestinian relationship to the US and other dominant powers, this is the longest lasting phase. All other phases were much shorter and were reconsidered and reassessed based on realities. And my question is, at which point do we reconsider this phase and this approach of ensuring that we remain within the U.S.'s sphere of influence when the U.S. has proved itself unable and unwilling to change its course of action and to pressure Israel into acknowledging Palestinian self-determination as a right, delivering Palestinian independence and statehood as Palestinians has demanded. For those who want, am I okay on time? 1 minute?
Yes.
I have a number of ways that I can describe to you what, under these 25 years, how the situation has worsened in empirical terms. Suffice it to say, I'll just compliment what Ambassador Zumlot said about the Jerusalem. The campaign to Judaize Jerusalem is explicit in the Israeli Master Plan of Jerusalem Master Plan of 2000, where it has stated a demographic goal, a demographic policy goal, to shift the balance of Jewish Israelis to Palestinian stateless persons from 70-30% to 60-40%, excuse me, from 60-40% to 70% to 30% by 2020. In this past week alone, 3 homes have been demolished and families have been expelled from their East Jerusalem homes. Since the beginning of this year, 45 homes have been demolished in East Jerusalem, making 126 people homeless, including 70 minors. These minors can do nothing with a job if they have no home, and they have no rights to stay in that home. So I'll end by saying that the apex of Palestinian hope for the U.S. to usher in a solution was under the Clinton administration, as we had been coming off the heels of tragedies in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, and President Clinton was the most eager to deliver this. I think that since then, it's been a downward spiral to the present, where this administration has appointed an ambassador, David Friedman, who only acknowledges that 2% of the West Bank is occupied. That's the condition that we're in. So there must be a shift in course for the Palestinians. And there's a robust history that has demonstrated that we're adept to that change, and that the Palestinians can change, and that we should change. So the question is, at which point does the evidence suffice to justify this shift? Or is this a political decision that's outside of the realm of logic and reason and based on blind faith alone? Oslo was a mistake from the beginning. Its structural limitations have become obvious throughout the Second Intifada, or what's known as the Al-Aqsa Intifada. And for those who have not been convinced, the question is, okay, at which point will you be convinced? So I'm asking a question to the audience and the policymakers. At which point do you think that we have reached the limit of the U.S.'s ability to actually be an honest broker and usher us into a new era? For me, it's a bit like climate change in the Trump administration. Despite what we've seen in evidence, and despite what we've seen in recent catastrophes that have ripped apart Houston, Florida, Puerto Rico, our administration continues to insist that there is no proof for climate change, and instead is pulling out of the Paris Climate Protocol. And I fear that we are headed on the same dead end as Palestinian leadership. and the predicament vis-a-vis the U.S.'s detrimental role is on this course. So I ask again, must we wait much longer to be harmed by these conditions, or can we agree on a particular point when the Palestinians should shift course and begin to engage in multilateralism and internationalism away from U.S. tutelage? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Noura. I know the challenge of surveying 100 years of history and the limited time we gave you was immense, but I think you met it exceedingly well, so thank you for that. We have a little bit of time for Q&A, and I would like to address a couple questions that we've received from the audience to the panel for whoever wants to address them. How do you see the Trump administration's commitment to the two-state solution, and how would this affect the future of peace negotiations?
Noura?
Well, Yousef, I'm sure you're going to participate in this as well.
It's all you. I've got my thoughts, but we'll leave it to the panel first. And
I would love to hear your thoughts as well. I'll just say in short, I think that the Trump administration's commitment to the two-state solution is not a commitment that is based on what Palestinians have demanded by the contours of UN Security Council's Resolution 242 and 338 and other norms of international law, but instead, in his eagerness to achieve a deal, it's achieving a deal based on what Israel is willing to concede rather than, for example, what might be viable, what might be necessary, what might be just and moral or legal on those terms. And so the desire to achieve this, we've already received indicators that, his son-in-law, who has been an envoy to the Middle East on this issue, has been received by the Palestinian leadership with coldness, which should tell us a lot of what we don't know exactly what's been offered, but it should tell us a lot that it's not hopeful. We've also understood, as a result of 25 years of studying this issue under the peace process framework, that the most of what's being offered, and I think the most that has been offered in the Camp David talks, is derivative sovereignty, is autonomy, is control over certain areas, much like what was presented to Namibia, also formerly known as Southwest Africa, as well as Black Africans in South Africa during the apartheid era in what's known as the Homeland Act, where Black Africans, under the dominance of a South African white regime, Afrikaner regime, were offered Bantustans where they can control their own economy, where they can run their own elections, where they can govern themselves and maintain sewage and garbage and education, but within limited areas of sovereignty. Namibia and the ANC rejected that, in fact, which leads to their independence in the late 80s. And unfortunately, we're in a situation where that is the most that's being offered to Palestinians. And when Arafat rejected those terms in 2000, the U.S. administration chastised him for not accepting the most generous offer when it was only the most generous relative to the dismal proposals that had been put on the table, but certainly not even up to par to what international law and morality would have demanded.
And I would just add, and this was actually the topic of another question very similar to the one that I just asked, was it, when Donald Trump said earlier this year, standing beside Benjamin Netanyahu at a press conference in February, he said, I'm not gonna, pick one state, two state. We got to see what the party's like. Something along those lines. It was dismissed by many because it was written off as sort of a inexperienced president making a statement that didn't really represent the policy of the United States. But I actually think if you look closely at what the administration has been doing at all levels, they have been very careful not to utter the words two-state solution. And I think what this represents is the reality that the United States looks at both of the parties and says both of the parties are not on board with this anymore. And we can't pretend that that's the case. The Israelis have moved on. They've moved on long ago from talking about a two-state solution. The right-wing Israeli government is very open about this. They are consistently advancing plans legislatively through the Israeli Knesset to bring about some forms of annexation of the West Bank. They are insistent on expanding settlements in an aggressive way, just this week announcing new settlement units in Hebron, which is, of course, deep inside the West Bank and one of the most difficult and tense locations in which Israeli apartheid manifests itself. So I think, you know, the Trump administration statement, position on the two-state solution, if anything, just underscores the fact that they're willing to let the Israelis lead this process more than any administration before. And they're only going to go as far as the Israelis want them to go, which I think is the worst-case scenario for Palestinians engaging in this process, which, of course, harkens back to Noura's question. I want to bring together a couple of the different questions that were posed here from the audience regarding development aid and unemployment, and try to marry them a little bit with some of the concerns raised in Noura's presentation. We know that there are great needs when it comes to the humanitarian situation on the ground and development in all sectors of Palestinian society and the economy. Oftentimes, support for those challenges, financial support for those challenges, comes from the very spheres of influence that the Palestinians have shifted into over the last period that Noura described. How is it that the Palestinian leaders can address this challenge of meeting the very real needs on the ground, knowing full well that often the material support for addressing those needs comes with political strings attached?
Sure. You want me to take a crack at that?
Sure.
I mean, I think this is an important question. I think, look, there are many sources of support for development aid within the Palestinian territories. Obviously, the U.S. And USAID has been one of the largest contributor and supporter of such aid. But there are many also sources from the European Union, from individual donors and others. Look, I think it's important to separate, and I know it's challenging because at the end of the day, there is a broader political process and political framework that needs to happen. Having said that, it is critically important for these development programs to continue. When you look at youth, 70% of the youth in Palestine under age 30. I mean, you're talking about an entire generation of young people that will be the future leaders of a state if there is ever a solution. And so one cannot neglect the needs of those young people. Now, I do agree with the issue that sometimes there are political strings attached. I dealt personally with aid in the Palestinian territories where there is these vetting procedures and other strings that come attached with aid. That notwithstanding, I would say by and large, those programs that are effective and support organizations like Noura and many others who are doing great work in the Palestinian territories are critically important and need to continue.
Yeah, let me just add, USAID in our Palestine program is the largest donor, but not even close to a majority of the funding. We get a lot of different funding. I mean, the folks that are working on the programming are always focused on development, and they're focused on getting the development done without politics interfering. And I think that our staff and our partners on the ground, for the most part, recognize that. And the political spat in the Gulf, our answer would be we don't have a dog in that fight, but all of you have Palestine in the fight, and all of you are committed to continuing support, and it's been lacking, as the numbers have shown. So we want to work with everyone. We have to work with everyone. We get in addition to thousands of individual donors, we work with 20, 30 different institutions, U.S., European, Gulf, international, et cetera, and that's critically important. That we have to work with as many partners and get as much funding as we can. Just a couple points on not on the two-state solution, but on the Trump administration. I think, not only are they coming in with biases, but they're coming in without expertise and without expecting to have been working on this issue, right? They didn't expect to win the election, and so. Plus, with so many never-Trumpers, persona non grata in the administration, there's a lot of experience and expertise out there in the Middle East that's not in the administration. Now, that can provide an opportunity, right? And my understanding is Jason Greenblatt, for one, is a listener, and he's talking with Palestinians, and he's listening to them. I hope to meet with him soon after my visit to Gaza. I understand, I heard that in a meeting with I think it was with the Middle East Investment Initiative, he was informed that a lot of the illegal building of settlements on Palestinians' lands includes on lands of Palestinians who are U.S. citizens, and that apparently affected him. He was quite astonished to hear that, right? So there's a learning curve, but that provides opportunity. The recent focus on Gaza may have started because the sewage is washing up on the shores of Israel. That gets Israel agitated about it. But my understanding is he's taken an interest in figuring out the fuel, the electricity, the water problem in Gaza. We can only hope. We've got to work on that. We have to, and there's education. One point I wanted to make to really demonstrate the slowing down of reconstruction in Gaza, under our previous community infrastructure emergency water and sanitation project, we were doing 1 10-ton truck a day was going into Gaza just for Noura projects. 1 10-ton truck a day. Now, over the first 5 years, almost 5 years of the PCID project, it's harder to count because the mechanism is harder to count, but it's about 1 a year. And that is a massive difference. The last thing I'll say, and there are a lot of security folks in the room here, that generals and the U.S. military over the last few years have made it a real central part of their mission to argue that the United States and the security of the United States needs defense and diplomacy and development. And the Israeli security forces, the Israeli army, and the security forces at large know that too. They know that collective punishment is not the answer, that there needs to be development, and so hopefully policymakers in this room, our own administration, are talking with Israeli security as much or more as they are with the settlers in the Israeli government, and understanding that development is really the key to everyone's security.
Thank you, Sean. We've got a lot of great questions here, and I'm going to try to do my best to get through as many of them as possible that time will allow. One of them, which is very relevant to news that has been breaking over the last few weeks, which is the reconciliation agreement between Hamas and Fatah and the return of the Ramallah-based PA administration to Gaza, is around this question of how the United States deals with this reconciliation agreement, whatever comes out of it, and any Palestinian entity in which Hamas is a part. Yesterday, the Israeli Prime Minister's office issued a statement that they will not engage in any way with a Palestinian government that includes any relationship with Hamas unless Hamas does, X, Y, Z, and it was a list of maybe, 12 different demands that basically, require Hamas to turn into Zionists before they would speak to the Israelis. At the same time, one frequent excuse that the Israelis have for not engaging with the Palestinians in negotiations is that unless there's reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas, then it makes no sense for the Israelis to talk to the Palestinian government because they are divided and they're not representative of the Palestinians, and who do they speak for? So they sort of play both sides. How does the U.S. navigate the political landscape now with the Hamas and Fatah deal when the Israelis are unwilling to work with the Palestinians, whether they are unified or divided?
Okay, that's a great question. It was really well put. So I want to do something similar and answer this question in maybe 4 parts as fast as possible. I'm not joking. So the first part is to say that this is not the first time that Israel has presented preconditions to Palestinians. The first time they presented preconditions was to the PLO in 1967 to 1987 on recognizing Israel, renouncing armed resistance, and recognizing the borders, Israeli, or accepting 242 as a framework. When the PLO did that in 1991 and not only entered into Oslo, but then changed its charter to remove a commitment to armed resistance, and then rescinded its resolution 3379 denouncing Zionism as a form of racism, the 1975 resolution. They've done everything. Israel has turned around and said, well, yeah, still, right? So even after the PLO acquiesced to every demand that Israel had been making for 20 years, Israel has turned around and said, yeah, we still don't think it's enough. This particular administration, this is my second point, the Mahmoud Abbas administration, which for those of us in this room who are thinking about governance, has been in place since 2010 without a presidential mandate, has done almost everything that the US and Israel has asked for as a matter of strategic course, right? Because we've never tried this before. Let's do everything that's being asked. Let's enter into security coordination. Let's renounce armed violence. Let's accept that refugees don't necessarily, at least he is president, that he wouldn't return as a refugee. And the response to that position of absolute acquiescence has been a threefold increase of settlers in the West Bank, the building of the wall that confiscates 13% of the West Bank, has been the Judaization of Jerusalem, and the entrenchment of the geographical and juridical divide between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. So we also have empirical evidence to show that no matter what Palestinians have done, from accepting these conditions to acquiescing to all the terms, Netanyahu has now turned around and said, never, ever, ever will there be a Palestinian state. And it's curious to me, when will we believe him? When will we believe him? So the third point that I want to make is then about these preconditions, which regards Hamas and Fatah. And I think Yousef has already made this point, that there can be no agreement without a unity government. And the US has set ample precedent of dealing with, of negotiating with those that they have deemed as terrorists on, designated terrorists on their State Department designations. And the fourth point that I want to make is that Hamas has proven itself to be a pragmatic political player, as evidenced by the fact that it has amended its charter, severed its ties with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and moved from Syria to Qatar in recent years, and yet we continue to deal with it as an irrational player, when what we've seen right now in this recent decision to actually give its control back to its rival political party, we have ample evidence that shows us that Hamas is a political, pragmatic player, and not an irrational actor that's hell-bent on destruction and motivated by hate. So again, the question is, at which point do we allow empiricism to trump biases, no pun intended, in order to chart a path forward that insists on engaging with this unity government as it is?
Thank you, Noura. A number of questions also focus on the theme of supporting Palestinian refugees, and specifically in Lebanon and also in Gaza. What can be done particularly for the refugee communities there? In Gaza, we know it's nearly 80% of the population, which is refugees from 1948 or their descendants. And the situation facing Palestinian refugees in Lebanon is perhaps the most dire of all. So what is it that can be done to specifically address and serve the needs of those communities?
So let me take a shot. So one thing I was very encouraged by in my recent visit to Palestine and Lebanon is that ANIRA really works indiscriminately with all communities. We obviously have a focus on refugees and particularly Palestinian refugees, but we're now working in Lebanon with Syrian refugees, with the Palestinians who were refugees in Syria and are now in Lebanon, but also with Syrian refugees, and with host communities. And for development to work and for communities to live together, grow together, you've got to work across communities. And so that was one of the more encouraging things I saw of ANIRA's work. And as you know, a lot of the aid and government service provision, or service provision, because often in Lebanon it's not the government. You get your services from your sectarian organization, your religious or your NGO organization that serves your community. And that can make for very fractured living. And as you know, tensions in Lebanon are quite acute. I mean, it's not surprising if you just think about the numbers, right? Imagine if in the US suddenly we had more than 400 million people here and 100 million of them were Syrian refugees. So that's what Lebanon is facing. But on top of that, the sectarianism that exists there exacerbates rather than alleviates, I think, a lot of those tensions. And so we think it's critical to be working across communities with both communities. If you're talking about a town where some huge percentage, 30, 40, 50, 60% of the inhabitants are now refugees, you also have to work with the host community or trying to figure this out. And we've been doing that. We've been doing that well.
I just want to say something here to say that the question of Palestinian refugees in the Middle East cannot be examined today without addressing the profound refugee crisis throughout the Middle East. So the Middle East is actually home and the source of the highest concentration of refugees in the world. And so it's not, Palestinian refugees happen to be the greatest population amongst them, but Syrian refugees, Yemeni refugees, Somali refugees, Sudani refugees are now in a very precarious, vulnerable position across the Middle East, where most of the states in the Middle East have not signed on to the 1951 Refugee Convention, meaning that they can shirk their responsibilities to absorb, to rehabilitate, to restitute, and to place, these are the durable solutions for refugees under the conventions, to place them in another host country. And instead, many of these refugees are facing refoulement to their sites of their original site where they were expelled or had to flee, where they're subject to great destitution. So part of answering this question is, other states need to open up their borders to absorb these refugees and to create temporary refugee regimes that we have international law that helps us outline what that looks like and provides their basic rights. If not that, then a human rights regime. Turkey, Jordan, Egypt, and Lebanon are the only states that have demonstrated some sort of temporary protection regime, and it's not enough. It's not enough. The Palestinian refugee crisis becomes the last thing on the list of priorities, subject to donor fatigue, if we don't address the crisis of these other refugee populations from these other countries. And that means a responsibility across the entire Middle East to address it.
Let me just underscore that. I agree entirely. You know, I don't know that people realize that just about half of the 22.5 million refugees in the world today are Palestinian or Syrian. People know there are a lot of Syrian refugees, but I don't think they recognize that about 5.5 million of each make up half of the total in the world. So we absolutely are committed to continuing a focus on both Palestinian and Syrian refugees. We all have to.
Thank you both. We're just about out of time, but we did get a question here that I want to make sure we address from a student in the audience. And maybe each of us could just very quickly rattle off any ideas that they may have. Are there opportunities for Palestinian students to intern in the United States? And I can tell you at our organization, we are always looking for young, bright, and ambitious Palestinian students who can add to the energy and dynamism in our work. So please do check us out among with the other organizations represented here.
Yeah, no, there are ample opportunities. There are organizations like Atlas Corps you should look at as well that also bring students, and many other programs that are there to support Palestinians and others, frankly, on doing internships or like one-year fellowships in the United States.
Look, visas are scandalously too hard for Palestinians to get, particularly Gazans, and that has to change. There has to be more compassion and humanitarianism in terms of permanent entry and visas for short-term internships or work. In terms of veneer, yes, we have internships. The more interesting internships, I would say, are probably in Palestine and Lebanon, and we have interns there, and we would welcome hearing from Palestinians who'd like to do internships with us.
Absolutely, yes. And so to whoever that young student is, the only thing that I'll advise is not specific organizations, but just don't stop knocking on doors until you get the internship that you want, and that'll lead you on to the next one. Persistence is key.
So with that, I want to thank all of our panelists for their contributions today, and thank you all for being in attendance, and once again, thanking the National Council for keeping Palestine at the top of the agenda. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Anthony for...
Yeah. Thank you, Yousef, and thank you all of the panelists for a very stimulating, insightful, informative session here.